Shadow, Kaydee are doing something different. Here's why it matters. Something is changing in Big Bear Valley, not in one dramatic moment, not through a single spectacular flight, and certainly not through one interaction that allows us to say, with confidence, that Shadow and Kaydee have officially become a new breeding pair. Instead, the change has been happening slowly. One perch at a time, one call at a time, one flight at a time, one visit to the nest at a time. If you watched only one of these moments, you might not think much of it. Kaydee lands near Shadow. Interesting. Kaydee follows Shadow. Interesting. They vocalize near each other. Interesting. Kaydee enters the nest. Very interesting. They move sticks together. Even more interesting. Their beaks briefly touch. Then Kaydee comes back to the nest, and later, Shadow appears to follow Kaydee. Suddenly, we're no longer looking at one isolated interaction. We're looking at a sequence. And that sequence raises a fascinating question. Are Shadow and Kaydee simply two bald eagles becoming comfortable around each other? Or are we watching the earliest stages of something much more important? To understand that, we need to stop looking at individual moments and start looking at the pattern. It began with tolerance. Before anything else could happen between Shadow and Kaydee, one basic condition had to exist. Shadow had to tolerate her. That might sound simple, but it matters. Shadow isn't wandering through unfamiliar territory. Big Bear is his established home range. He knows the important trees, the roosting areas, the nest, the places where he has spent years with Jackie. When another eagle enters that environment, Shadow has options. He can ignore the visitor. He can tolerate it temporarily, or he can actively defend his territory. Kaydee didn't disappear after one encounter. Instead, she remained. Then she returned and returned again. That repetition is where this story begins. At first, Kaydee's presence could easily have been explained as curiosity, a younger eagle moving through an established territory. Nothing more. But as August progressed, she increasingly appeared around Shadow, and Shadow continued allowing her to remain nearby. That doesn't automatically mean affection, but tolerance is the foundation upon which every later interaction depends. Without it, there is no shared perch, no following, no nest visit, no stick work, no close contact, and perhaps no story at all. Then came proximity. One of the easiest behaviors to overlook is simply distance. How close are two eagles willing to be? An eagle doesn't need to attack another bird for distance to matter. Sometimes one moves away, sometimes one maintains a buffer, sometimes one refuses to share a preferred location, but Shadow and Kaydee began appearing increasingly close to one another. Not constantly, they still spent plenty of time apart, and that is important. We shouldn't imagine them behaving like inseparable companions every hour of every day. They didn't. Instead, what made their proximity interesting was that it kept happening voluntarily. They separated, then came back into the same areas. Kaydee appeared near Shadow. Shadow tolerated her. They used overlapping parts of the territory. Then another layer appeared. Communication. They started talking. Bald eagles communicate vocally for many reasons. So hearing Shadow and Kaydee vocalize near one another does not automatically mean courtship. Context matters, but repeated vocal exchanges tell us something basic. The two birds are aware of each other. They are communicating. They are responding to another eagle, occupying the same environment. Throughout their recent interactions, Shadow and Kaydee have repeatedly been observed vocalizing in proximity. Sometimes the exchanges were short. Sometimes they occurred around familiar perches. On August 25, for example, the two were again observed in the same general area and exchanging vocalizations before continuing with separate activities. That last part is important. They didn't need to remain physically attached for the association to continue. They could communicate, separate, and later appear within the same behavioral landscape again. That suggests something more interesting than constant chasing. It suggests familiarity. Then Kaydee started following Shadow. This became one of the clearest patterns. Shadow would move. Kaydee would follow, again and again. Sometimes the delay was extremely short. On August 23, one documented example showed Shadow departing a perch and Kaydee leaving approximately 2 seconds later. 2 seconds. She was effectively right behind him. Now, we should be careful with the word following. Two birds flying in the same direction once does not establish a relationship, but repetition changes the interpretation. Kaydee repeatedly showed interest in Shadow's movements. Where was he going? Where would he land? Would she go too? Increasingly, the answer seemed to be yes. This is when many viewers naturally began wondering whether Kaydee was becoming attached to Shadow. But at that point, there was still an obvious imbalance. Kaydee seemed to be doing most of the pursuing. She followed. She approached. She appeared nearby. Shadow mostly seemed to tolerate her, and that distinction would become important later. Before that happened, however, Kaydee crossed another boundary. She began sharing areas associated with Shadow's roosting behavior. Shared roosting areas. Nighttime behavior can tell us something different from a quick daytime encounter. A bird can pass through a territory during daylight and disappear. But remaining around familiar roosting areas suggests a greater level of comfort with the environment. Shadow and Kaydee were observed using the same general roosting areas. Again, we shouldn't exaggerate this. Sharing a general roost area is not the same thing as proving a pair bond, but place it alongside everything else. Proximity, vocalization, following, repeated returns. Kaydee wasn't simply visiting for a few minutes anymore. She was becoming increasingly integrated into the places Shadow routinely used. And then she reached the location that made all the previous behavior look much more significant, the nest. August 23, the nest changes the equation. This was arguably the strongest interaction between Shadow and Kaydee up to that point. Shadow entered the nest. Kaydee joined him, and the two remained there together for more than 10 minutes. This matters because a nest isn't simply another branch for an established adult bald eagle like Shadow. This structure is part of his reproductive territory. It is a location he has maintained and used through previous breeding seasons. It is deeply connected to his long partnership with Jackie. Kaydee wasn't simply standing somewhere near Shadow. She was inside his nest. And Shadow allowed her to remain there. But then something even more interesting happened. They began interacting with the nest itself. Sticks moved. Both birds participated in manipulating material. That immediately attracted attention because nest maintenance is one of the behaviors viewers associate with established eagle pairs preparing for breeding. Does moving a few sticks prove Shadow and Kaydee are a pair? No, absolutely not. But does it deserve attention? Yes. Especially because Kaydee didn't simply inspect the structure from a distance. She actively participated while Shadow was present. Two eagles, one nest, shared activity, and then the distance between them became even smaller, the beak interaction. At one point, Shadow and Kaydee came face to face. Their beaks touched. Kaydee then appeared to nibble around Shadow's beak. It was brief. Shadow tolerated some of it. Then he reacted when Kaydee continued. That moment could easily be sensationalized. You could call it a kiss. You could declare that Shadow had accepted a new mate. You could say the entire question was settled. But none of those interpretations would be responsible. More interesting explanation is actually more subtle. Kaydee and Shadow may have been negotiating boundaries. Kaydee approached. Shadow tolerated the contact. Kaydee continued. Shadow responded. This is what makes watching developing relationships between wild animals so fascinating. Acceptance isn't necessarily absolute. An eagle can tolerate another bird and still establish limits. Shadow's response didn't necessarily mean rejection, but his tolerance before the response didn't necessarily mean romance either. What it showed clearly was that the two birds were interacting at very close range, and Kaydee was comfortable enough to initiate that contact. Then came perhaps the most important clue of all. She didn't disappear afterward. Kaydee came back. If the August 23 nest interaction had ended with Kaydee leaving Big Bear and never returning, it would be much easier to interpret it as an isolated encounter. But she remained part of Shadow's environment. 2 days later, on August 25, the nest became important again. Late in the afternoon, Shadow arrived there alone. He stayed for more than an hour. Eventually, Shadow departed. Then Kaydee appeared at the same nest afterward. This time, there was no dramatic interaction between them inside the structure. They weren't there together during that sequence, but from a behavioral perspective, Kaydee's return was still meaningful. She now knew the nest, and she was returning independently. This was no longer simply a case of Kaydee following Shadow directly into the structure. She was beginning to use the location herself. One visit might be curiosity. Repeated visits become a pattern, and if those visits continue into fall, the pattern becomes even more important. And something appeared to reverse. Up to this point, the developing relationship had one very obvious feature. Kaydee was usually the pursuer. Shadow moved. Kaydee followed. Shadow occupied an area. Kaydee appeared nearby. Shadow went somewhere. Kaydee seemed interested in going too. That raised an obvious question. Was Shadow genuinely interested in Kaydee, or was he simply tolerant of an unusually persistent visitor? And August 26 added another piece. During the interactions observed that day, Shadow appeared to follow Kaydee. For the first time, the dynamic seemed to reverse. Kaydee moved. Shadow went after her. Now, one flight doesn't prove anything by itself, and this point is extremely important. If Shadow follows Kaydee once and never does it again, that flight may ultimately tell us very little. But when you place it beside the previous sequence, it becomes worth watching. Because pair relationships are not built only through one bird pursuing another. Reciprocity matters. Does Shadow respond? Does Shadow approach? Does Shadow choose to remain near Kaydee? Does Shadow ever follow her? Now perhaps the answer to that final question is yes. And if we see it repeatedly, the story changes dramatically. From one-way interest to two-way association. This may be the biggest question facing Shadow and Kaydee right now. Kaydee's interest has been obvious. She keeps coming back. Shadow's position has been more difficult to interpret. He has clearly tolerated her. He has shared important spaces with her. He has vocalized around her. He has allowed her into the nest. He has participated in stick manipulation while she was there. But tolerance and active interest are not necessarily the same thing. That's why Shadow initiating movement toward Kaydee matters. If that behavior becomes repeated, we may begin seeing a transition. Not simply, Kaydee wants to be around Shadow, but Shadow and Kaydee are choosing to be around each other. That is a much more meaningful pattern. So are they forming a pair bond? This is the question everyone wants answered. And right now, the most accurate answer is possibly. There are encouraging signs, but the story isn't finished. A raptor biologist who evaluated their behavior has suggested that Shadow and Kaydee appear to be forming a pair bond and considered the possibility of them becoming a pair by the next nesting period highly likely. That is significant. It tells us that the behaviors viewers are noticing aren't necessarily meaningless. But appearing to form a pair bond is different from saying they are definitely a breeding pair. There are stronger behaviors we should still look for, and the coming months could provide them. Sign number 1, more reciprocal following. The first thing to watch is whether Shadow continues following Kaydee. This is one of the easiest changes to identify. Does Kaydee leave and Shadow immediately respond? Does Shadow seek her out? Does he move toward her perch? Do their flights become increasingly coordinated? If yes, the apparent relationship becomes much more balanced. Kaydee would no longer be the only bird repeatedly closing the distance. Shadow would be participating too. Sign number 2, or nest work. The nest may become the most important camera in this entire story. Watch the sticks. Who brings them? Who moves them? Who stays? Does Kaydee arrive independently? Does Shadow arrive while she is already there? Do they begin spending increasingly long periods working together? Nest maintenance can become especially interesting as breeding season approaches. If Shadow and Kaydee repeatedly invest effort into the same structure, that would be much stronger evidence than one isolated stick-moving session in August. Sign number 3. Courtship. This would change the conversation significantly. Courtship flights, more coordinated movement, increasingly consistent close association, potential mating behavior. Those would provide much stronger evidence that the relationship is moving toward breeding. And this is why patience matters. August may be showing us the beginning, but fall and early winter could show us what the beginning actually means. Sign number 4, consistency. Perhaps the most important clue isn't dramatic at all. It's repetition. Anyone can watch one exciting clip and build a story around it, but animal behavior becomes meaningful through patterns. Does Kaydee remain? Does Shadow continue tolerating her? Do they continue vocalizing? Do they continue sharing territory? Does Kaydee continue visiting the nest? Does Shadow increasingly respond to her movements? Week after week, month after month, if the answer continues to be yes, the evidence becomes much stronger, and that is what makes this story different now. At the beginning, Kaydee was simply an eagle near Shadow. Then she became the eagle following Shadow. Then the eagle vocalizing with him. Then the eagle remaining in his territory. Then the eagle entering his nest. Then the eagle moving sticks beside him. Then the eagle touching his beak. Then the eagle returning to the nest. And now, perhaps the eagle Shadow is beginning to follow too. Each step alone is small. Together, they form something much larger. Progression. This is not about replacing Jackie. There is another important part of this story. Kaydee isn't Jackie. Whatever happens next doesn't erase what came before. Shadow and Jackie's history remains part of Big Bear. Their years together, their nesting seasons, their eaglets, their storms, their failures, their successes, all of that remains. But nature continues moving, and Kaydee isn't entering this story to become a copy of another eagle. If she develops a relationship with Shadow, it will be her relationship. Different behaviors, different dynamics, a completely different chapter, and perhaps that's the healthiest way to understand what we're watching. Not as replacement, but continuation. The next few months could tell us everything. Right now, Shadow and Dee occupy a fascinating middle ground. They are clearly more than two completely unrelated eagles who happen to pass each other once. Their repeated interactions make that increasingly difficult to argue. But they are not yet a confirmed breeding pair. That leaves us in the most interesting part of the story, the transition. We get to watch what happens before the answer is known. Every flight matters a little more. Every nest visit matters. Every vocalization, every stick. Every decision Shadow makes when Kaydee approaches. Every decision Kaydee makes when Shadow leaves. Maybe the relationship strengthens. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe Kaydee eventually disappears. Maybe another eagle changes the dynamic. Or maybe as winter approaches, we begin seeing something unmistakable. Two eagles rebuilding one nest together. And if that happens, we may look back at these quiet August days and realize something extraordinary. The story didn't begin with mating. It didn't begin with a spectacular courtship flight. It didn't begin with one obvious moment where Shadow suddenly accepted Kaydee. It began much more quietly. The tolerance, then proximity, then communication, then following, then shared space, then the nest, then sticks, then close contact, then repeated returns, and finally, perhaps, reciprocity. That's why what Shadow and Kaydee are doing right now matters. Not because any one behavior proves what they will become, but because the behaviors are beginning to connect. Kaydee keeps coming back. Shadow keeps allowing her closer. And now Shadow may even be beginning to move toward her. So the next time you see these two eagles together, don't only watch the dramatic moment. Watch what happens before it. Watch who arrives first. Watch who follows. Watch the distance between them. Listen to the calls. Watch the nest. Watch the sticks. And most importantly, watch whether the same behavior happens again. Because somewhere inside those tiny repeated choices may be the answer to the biggest question surrounding Big Bear right now. Are Shadow and Kaydee simply becoming comfortable with each other? Or are we watching the first stages of Big Bear's next bald eagle pair? We don't know yet. But for the first time, there may be enough pieces on the board to seriously ask the question, and the answer could be unfolding right in front of us.